Now here's an intriguing thought. Charles Darwin, the man who did so much to explain to us how life evolved on this planet, may have seriously considered, perhaps even accepted, the possibility that life arrived here in a meteorite. Dr. John Van Wyhe, historian of science at Cambridge, has been exploring this theory for a paper he's giving in Oxford, and he's here, as is Dr. Caroline Smith, the meteorite curator at the National Natural History Museum. Dr. Van Wyhe, this all revolves around a meeting that Charles Darwin is said to have had with a German geologist who presented him with a meteorite which appeared to contain organic matter in it. Is that right?
Yes, well, this surprising claim, we've just announced this at the British Society for the History of Science conference, purports that this extraordinary acceptance by Darwin took place in a meeting with this German geologist showing him microscopic preparations which appeared to show fossil organisms. And according to this report that's just been uncovered from Science magazine in 1880, Darwin looked through the microscope and leapt from his seat, crying, "Almighty God, what a wonderful discovery! Wonderful!" Well, that's the claim.
Is it true?
Well, there's a bit of a detective story to find out whether it's true. Otto Hahn did send Darwin a copy of his book, and it still exists. It's still at Down House. And he did send Darwin some letters, but we don't know what Darwin wrote back. Now, there are some quotations in this extraordinary article from an unknown Darwin letter. So there's some legitimacy there. Whether or not he actually visited Darwin, we don't know. It is possible. But later on, a geologist at UCL wrote to Darwin's son and said, "I saw this article in Science about your father. Is this true?" Well, Darwin himself wrote back to him, but unfortunately that letter doesn't survive.
So the key bit of the detective story is missing.
Yeah, well, fortunately the geology professor wrote back to Darwin, thanking him for his letter, and saying, "Yes, I knew I shouldn't have believed that report."
So it sounds as if the article may have been...
I think it's definitely an exaggeration, but it doesn't tell us whether or not Dr. Hahn actually visited.
But you, as I understand it, Dr. Smith, have looked into the background of this from the geologist's perspective, as it were, and you think you might have found the meteorite that he could have been shown if he was.
Well, I wouldn't say that. I mean, we do know the meteorite that Dr. Van Wyhe is talking about is a meteorite called Wyhe, which fell in France in 1864. It's a very, very rare type of meteorite. There's only 9 in existence. And it is, one of its characteristics is that it has a lot of organic content, a lot of carbon in it. It's a type of meteorite called a carbonaceous chondrite. And this meteorite caused a lot of stir in the scientific community when it landed and was found. And there is a report in a 1964 paper in Science by some American scientists which actually report that one of the stones that they investigated has been contaminated by seeds, by reed, and by glue, by animal-derived glue. And they actually are, in the paper, they're very, very careful not to say this is deliberate contamination. But
presumably there's glue in it.
Yes. I mean, as they say, we leave it to the reader to make up his own mind of whether this was a deliberate or accidental contamination. But it's a very, very interesting story, and it's one of these really great examples where science and history cross to make an absolutely fascinating detective story. It's brilliant.
But if that was the one that Darwin was shown, he possibly was the victim of a deliberate hoax.
Well, possibly, and Dr. Hahn could have been a victim of a deliberate hoax, as could have been the French scientists in the National Museum in Paris where this stone actually came from. So, I mean, they could well have been, but it's such a fascinating story.
I suppose common sense suggests to us, Dr. Van Wyhe, that if he really did believe the theory being put to him, he might have said a thing or two about it in public, since it was a pretty remarkable theory to advance.
I think it's extremely unlikely that Darwin believed any such thing. He didn't make many public statements about his views on the origin of life, where life originally came from. But he did believe that it was by some natural process, and I think he believed it happened. It happened on Earth. That's pretty clear, I think, if you look at all of his letters and comments. This claim first came about, I think, in 1871 at a British Association meeting. Sir William Thomson, later Lord Kelvin, claimed that life could come to Earth on meteorites.
Well, before we get into the beginning of life, we'd better stop. Dr. Van Wyhe and Dr. Smith, thank you.
On 5 Live.
Did the man who originated the theory of evolution believe life came from outer space? It's been claimed that Charles Darwin saw examples of structures described as fossil organisms found in meteorites by a German geologist called Otto Hahn. This is an idea that's being explored by Dr. John Van Wyhe from Cambridge University, an expert on Darwin, and he's with us now. Good morning.
Good morning.
Nice to have you with us in the studio. Just explain exactly what these structures were.
Well, they were tiny little structures that had a regular shape, so they didn't look like they were just crystals or random minerals. They looked like they were something that must have once been alive. Now, Otto Hahn was convinced that these were fossils of living things from space, and he did send his book with photographs to Charles Darwin. Now, the article that's just been discovered from 1880 claims that he also paid a visit on Charles Darwin and showed him the specimens. And then there's an attributed quotation that Darwin looked through the microscope and leapt up and said, "Almighty God, what a wonderful discovery, wonderful."
But that doesn't necessarily link that to his theory of evolution, does it?
Well, it doesn't even it doesn't even show that that's actually true. I mean, someone claimed Darwin said this. Now, I can't disprove it, but I have found a letter from someone who wrote to Darwin and asked, I saw this article in Science, is it true? Well, Darwin wrote back to him, but that letter is lost. But fortunately, the man replied and said, "Dear Mr. Darwin, thank you very much. I knew you couldn't believe in something as silly as that." So we don't know what he was referring to. Did he say, "I didn't say that"? Or did he say, I don't believe it"?
But it wasn't that he was contesting that these structures had come from outer space, just that they depicted some sort of life form. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, the meteorite definitely came from outer space. Darwin probably didn't accept that the structures were fossils, but there was a big controversy at the time about how far back life actually went, because there was an end to the fossil record. Life went back so far and they didn't know what happened before that.
They didn't have the means to explore it more fully. This geologist, Otto Hahn, then, is his theory accurate that these were some sort of fossils of living organisms from some other world?
Well, he did have some limited scientific support in the early days, but eventually it was shown that his structures were in fact just natural formations in the rocks from being heated and cooled, and so he was discredited and eventually emigrated to Canada.
And do these fossils still exist somewhere?
They do, yes. Well, meteorites, well, they're not fossils. They're
Sorry, no,
they're
of course not.
Structures,
yes. As we now know.
Yeah, but of course, meteorites are extremely valuable, and so, of course, every little piece of them tends to be preserved.
Yeah, and there's no reference to this at all in Darwin's actual writings on the theory of evolution, is there?
He doesn't refer to meteorites, but he does in one or two places refer to the origin of life. He tends to say, well, that's beyond current science. But he believed that it probably had a natural beginning in some pool somewhere with the right chemicals and some electricity.
Yeah, so, I mean, he was pretty close then to what scientists believe today.
Yeah, that's the amazing thing. I mean, people nowadays, you couldn't get a better guess.
His evolutionary theory has come under closer scrutinies in the last part, particularly of the last century and in recent years. Do you think that's justified?
Well, to me, it's difficult to understand, because Darwin published his book Origin of Species in 1859, and within about 10 years, the international scientific community had accepted his views.
But he sat on it for many years, didn't he?
He did, he sat on it, he wasn't finished, and he published about 14 books in this period, from after he thought of the theory till he finally managed to bring it out. So, I mean, it's a big deal. I mean, he had to prove that all life on Earth changes, and that all the species that exist now are descended from earlier forms. That's a lot to prove in one book.
Is there any merit to this notion, then, that meteorites could have been the original source of life on this Earth?
Well, these kinds of stories are still cropping up today. I mean, when I found this, I couldn't believe that in Darwin's days people were saying this, because it sounds so modern. So it really came. It's come again and again that the claim that life could have come from meteorites, but as far as we know, we still don't have any.
You don't put much credit in that.
No.
There's no.
Well, if you think that a tiny rock is a likely place, what about this big one we're sitting on right now? It seems like a pretty good place.
Yeah, no, fair enough. Does the origin of species, then, in your view, still most fully explain exactly how we got to where we are now?
Well, obviously, science has moved on a lot since Darwin, but the reason that Darwin is still celebrated is that his general framework is still in place.
Very interesting. Thank you very much for telling us about that. Dr. John Van Wyhe from Cambridge University. It's now 7:46.
Across the UK.